All right. We are here to talk about the art of facilitation. Hopefully this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. I was on a plane recently, and sometimes on the plane, like before they take off and shut the gate, they always tell everyone, this is the flight going to Houston. That's where I was going. If this is not the flight you wanted, now's your chance to get off. And I'm like, how would that ever happen? So you're here to hopefully hear about facilitation, and this isn't a surprise to you. So we're going to talk about meetings, and I'm guessing this is a wide variety of a group, but I'm also guessing that you guys sit in meetings, if not every day, at least once a week. Some of them are probably not as good. Some of them could be better. So that's what we're going to talk about today. As a quick introduction, my name is Yvonne. I'm a business analyst, business cat. So these days at PromptWorks, that usually means I'm either a business analyst or a project manager, scrum master. So you've probably, probably worked on a team with someone like me. And you can see from the end that I have a couple stickies up there for Agile ceremonies. All about Agile, love it. Went Agile about 7 or 9 years ago. Haven't really looked back. I think that there's really not a better way to do software development, at least from my experience. And then we're here to talk about meetings because it's not really a meeting until someone's time is being wasted. So, all right. So what is facilitation? I can kind of start off by giving you guys the proverbial analogy. Facilitation is a lot like herding cats, but I'll tell you what it isn't, and it's basically not any scenario where you're in a workshop and you're facilitating and really trying to take people through very specific examples. It's not a retro, for instance. For those of you who are on Agile teams, retros, you have very targeted discussions and very specific roles to play. Other Agile meetings, these are all not facilitation. Facilitation is actually the process of designing and running a successful meeting. That's it. A lot of herding cats is involved, so this is you and me. I assume that's why you're here. You want to learn how to become a better facilitator, and you want the people in the meetings to love you, to really like you as a facilitator. So they'll like you, and you're going to get information out of them, and you're going to come and get to the decision that you need. But as a facilitator, your job is to herd all the cats, and your job is basically to be a guide or a discussion leader for the group. It's to provide leadership without necessarily taking the reins, without necessarily solving the problem or telling people maybe what the technical solution is. Your job is to get other people in the group, all these people that you're trying to herd, you're trying to get them to take responsibility and take the lead and figure out whatever it is that you as a group have met to do. So that's something that I like to call out because I think a lot of us are always going to find ourselves in meetings where you're either in a meeting and you're either there as a participant, which is great because then you can kind of sit back and just observe and watch things flow, or if you're the leader of a meeting, then you're there to get things done, right? And you really want to you're there to get through an agenda, you're there to get things done, you need the team to stay on track and come up with a solution. You're probably there to tell them what the solution is. That's not what a facilitator does. A facilitator really steps back and says, it's not about me, I'm just here to help you guys figure out a solution. And the solution is not even going to come from me, I'm just here to help you out. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through a lot of different tools, techniques, tricks, hopefully that you guys will like so that at the end of the day, the entire group can stand back and say, wow, that person was a really great facilitator and they helped me out. And hopefully you will learn some things that you can use in your stand-ups, in your retros, in your weekly project status meetings, what have you. So let me start off by kind of level setting and talking about the shared pool of understanding. This is an interesting concept I read a while back that applies to every single meeting you've ever been with. If you're ever in a room with with a couple of people and you're in a meeting, shared pool of understanding is hugely important. So what happens is that you know, if you get a bunch of people together, we're all going to have different ideas, we're all going to have different concepts, different contexts in our mind, and by meeting as a group together, you begin to start building this shared pool. And what you say vocally, verbally into the meeting helps build that. Sometimes when people sit back and they just think things in their head, doesn't contribute to the shared pool of understanding. And so this is something that is kind of abstract, but as a facilitator, if you can kind of keep this in the back of your mind and be aware of how people in the room and how you can also be contributing to the shared pool of understanding, it's a pretty powerful analogy. Visuals, I'm big on visuals, so now I'm going to throw in my visuals. So, so you all get to a meeting, and you can see there are people thinking, oh, we're going to build an app. We're all in agreement. And as you can see, they're all thinking about this app in their head, and one guy thinks, oh, we're going to build a square. And another person thinks, oh, we're going to build a triangle or a circle, and they're all thinking this. But when you go to the meeting, hopefully with the aid of a really good, powerful facilitator, you start talking about it, and then you all probably will realize, oh, now as we start vocalizing and putting things out into the shared pool of understanding, now we kind of have that, ooh, we're not all actually talking about the same thing. And so then as you go along and you keep talking, you said, well, what if we do this? And now we're going to be building something that looks like a square peg in a triangular hole, whatever. So shared pool of understanding is something that I like to refer back to often. And if you take nothing else away from this slide, think about the power of visuals in your meetings. We'll come back to that later. We'll talk about a few things that you should be doing before, during, and after your meetings. Before your meeting, be sure to prepare adequately. This is actually something that I think is easy for us to skip if we get busy, if there are meetings on top of other meetings that we have to get to. But you should never actually forget about the actual aspect of preparing. So if you have an agenda, by all means, put one together if you haven't, and send it out. Don't be afraid to schedule a meeting. And a lot of the times in the meeting invites that I'll send out, I will literally put into the calendar invite, the purpose of this meeting is, you know, the goal of this meeting is, ... And sometimes that's nice to reiterate at the beginning of a meeting too. It sounds pretty simple, but just doing that is a great way of level setting and letting people know, here's what we're going to meet to talk about, and you're kind of setting the stage. As a facilitator, know the room layout, know the format, the physical format of where you're going to go. Sometimes this can be really, really important depending on what kind of meeting you're going to be having and what you're facilitating to get out of someone. For instance, if you're having a more informational session like we are today, it might not make sense to have like, you know, cafeteria style where you just have rows with tables, rows with tables. If you're trying to have a session where you want to emphasize the equality of everyone there and the equality of all their ideas, maybe something like a round table or a square table or a U shape where everyone can see each other would be a better format. I don't think it's unusual at all. Sometimes I've gotten weird looks from office managers or assistants when I ask them, oh, where's the room, and do you mind if I rearrange the tables and chairs? But you absolutely should as a facilitator, because the physical layout of your room can actually detract from or help you in your meeting. And then another part of preparation is choose your group size wisely. Right? To me, the ideal size for holding a meeting is about 4 to 7 people, which incidentally is also usually what they say is the most effective size for team sizes. But to me, having about 4 people to 7 people puts you right in that zone where you have all your key decision makers. You have everyone generally who's going to know what they're talking about and who can make a decision versus not. I'll offer by way of example. I remember one time when I was working at a client, I was invited to a weekly call, a weekly meeting. It was on the phone. It was over a conference meetup, and there were reliably 20 people dialing into the call. And so one day I asked my project manager, after I sat back and observed for a while, I was just like, why are there 20 people on this call, and how much do you actually get done? And I was shushed. So know how many people, have in mind how many people you're going to invite and tailor your meeting accordingly. If you have too many people, it's probably not going to be as efficient a meeting as if you have the right number of people. All right, so for this next slide, let me get a show of hands. Who knows what nimawashi is? Anyone? Raise your hands. Oh, you know because I told you. Jason knows because I told him. So I learned this word one year, and it just made the former management consultant heart in me sing. I was like, nimawashi. Nimawashi is also, you can also think of it as pre-wiring. No heads are nodding. Divide and conquer. Okay, great. All right. Nimawashi is a Japanese term for the informal process of quietly laying the foundation for some proposed change or project by talking to the people concerned and gathering feedback and support, right? So when I said divide and conquer, a lot of heads started nodding because I want to think that a lot of us, maybe even in personal situations like at Thanksgiving when you're going to be lobbying for your favorite side dish and someone else may not want it, but you're going to have the whole clan there and you need to decide. You could use nimawashi, where you go out and you start canvassing the individual people, you divide and conquer, you sort out the vegetarians from the vegans, from the staunch meat eaters, and you figure out what your favorite side dish is. Nimawashi is a very, very useful concept to know. Again, for any of that pre-meeting groundwork, the prep that you can do. If you know, for instance, you're going to be proposing a framework that the team hasn't been using at all and they're not going to be familiar with it, and you know that, for instance, your lead architect is resistant to change, maybe you want to talk about nimawashi. If you know, for instance, that you have a team that's just been kind of lagging and you're there to introduce maybe a new process change and the team might be afraid of change, maybe you should go through and start canvassing people and getting their opinion. And basically, you know, nimawashi ties into the other theme that I like to say all the time, which is no surprises. If you have no surprises, then everyone's happy. And nimawashi is that handy-dandy term to kind of communicate the process of going out there and making sure that you just, you know, lay your groundwork and make sure that everyone knows what you're going to be talking about. If they know what you're going to be talking about, then you can get the feedback early. You can tailor your message and respond to any critiques that you might hear. And again, going through the process of no surprises make for a successful meeting. So that's before your meeting. And now let's get to the nitty-gritty. We'll talk about some of the very tactical things you can do as a facilitator during your meeting to make it a good one. So let's talk about your meeting. These are all of the things that I already assume as facilitators you're doing. So these are kind of your meeting 101 type of things that I'm just going to gloss over, but if you guys have any questions, stop me and we can talk about these in more detail. You're starting on time. No brainer, right? You're setting some ground rules. This is often a neglected step, but is super handy if you're meeting with a new group of people you've never met with before, or say you might be starting a meeting series and you have a lot of stuff to get through, but you want to make sure that that everyone knows what to do. So no screens during retro. That's one of my ground rules. So I usually say that to the teams when I have during retro, and then if someone pulls up a screen and starts coding, then I can point at them later and say no screens, and then they just they make a face and they shut the laptop and there are no screens. Ground rules are hugely important and really useful for helping you as the facilitator make sure that that you just kind of keep everyone's attention focused and that everyone knows what to do during the meeting. Again, I'm not going to go over these in too much detail. You're explaining what your meeting is going to cover. Hopefully, you've already sent out that agenda. Hopefully, you've already explained in the meeting invite what people are there for. But believe it or not, people don't read, and they still may not know why they're in your meeting. And so maybe you lead off with your meeting and just tell them, hey, here's what we're here to talk about today. Or you might even say, you know, today we want to get this goal. We want to make this decision out of the next hour or 2 hours, or hopefully you're not in a meeting longer than 2 hours. Sticking to your agenda, very hard. We'll go into how you can do this, especially when you have a wide variety of attendees with agendas of their own. Recording as you go. So this is also really important as a facilitator because even if you might be recording on video or audio as you go, As a facilitator, it's a really good idea that you as the facilitator record your notes and the decisions that you hear, because this is what you're going to be telling the group. Hey, here's what happened at the end of the meeting. When you walk out, here's what we decided. Unless you have a really good memory, it's something I suggest you do. Don't turn to the youngest person in the room and ask them to scribe for you. Not cool. Don't turn to the only female in the room and ask her to scribe for you. I can tell you from experience, not cool. So record as you go. Take your own notes. Finish on time or even early. No one will ever complain if you finish on time, or if you let them have more time out there. And you're using a facilitator. So, all right. So, during the meeting, this is your Zen slide. Know thyself. So you're the facilitator. We talked a little bit about what that means, how it's different from someone who's leading a meeting. You're there to facilitate. So like I said before, you don't need to find the solution. That's actually something that took me a while to grasp. When I first started out as a facilitator, I got up in front of a group. I was nervous because I was in front of a group. And then suddenly I was concerned about appearing smart and contributing to the solution. And as a person, with fairly little experience in a lot of the groups that I was facilitating, that's a really good way to look silly really fast. Because chances are there are going to be a lot of people in the room who are smarter than you and who know a lot more than you are, than you do about the particular domain. So you're not there to help find the solution. Can't emphasize how strongly enough how important that is. You're there to help guide everyone as that meeting facilitator into finding the solution and basically getting others to lead themselves there. But even though you may not be an expert in the domain, know the arc of where you want that conversation to go, right? So even if I'm headed into, say, a meeting with a couple technical teams, and I know that it's going to be talking about, just technical domains that I don't have any expertise in, I should know as a facilitator, you know what, here are the areas that we need to hit. And we talked about this exception here, and this problem popped up in production the other day, and we should take that into account. And so as a facilitator, know all the bases that you need to cover, and generally the different points in the discussion where you want to guide the conversation to go, right? That's your responsibility as a facilitator, to make sure that you're covering all the topics that are important to get, to make sure that the group gets the decisions that they need to get out of that 1 hour meeting. State the obvious. I'm a fan of stating the obvious because actually in a lot of meetings, and in life really, sometimes we'll dance around the issue. If you've ever been in, let's say you have a meeting with multiple teams who aren't used to talking to each other, they're probably not going to state the obvious. Like, your app is broken, you have too many bugs, stop sending us bad bugs. People will not say these things. You can say them diplomatically, but never underestimate the power of just plainly, hey, here's the obvious, let's talk about it and get you guys to find a solution. Be crisp. This is something I try to remember for myself. Sometimes I can go on. And as a facilitator, that's a really great way to get people to tune you out. So be crisp and to the point, be eloquent, and then let someone else take the stage. Let the group work it out. I think that one's self-explanatory at this point. I've kind of talked about that. Let them, find their own solution. And then, like Yoda, speak or don't speak, right? As a facilitator, it should be really important that you should be able to kind of look at the room and see how the conversation's going, and if you know your arc and maybe one point is being neglected, step in, get the group's attention, hey, what about this? Or as a facilitator, you may step in and say, okay, I think what I'm hearing is this, and you might summarize for them and be a more active participant. But then there might be other points of your meeting where you have really great discussion going, and they might be taking a 5-minute detour into a really thorny technical issue, but you just let them work it out. And at that point, it might be good for you to just kind of step back and just observe and watch things move along, and just not speak at all. So I can also tell you in a little bit. I have some slides coming up talking about what happens if you have people who just kind of go on and on and on. So know thyself. Be like Yoda. Another thing you can do during the meeting, and this is something that I like to do even for entertainment. Read the people in the room. Sometimes there are cases where I'll be in a meeting, and if it's especially a meeting where I'm not driving and I'm not responsible for the meeting, and it's a really boring meeting, I'll actually sit back in my chair and just kind of start watching the meeting. And it's just really, really enlightening and illuminating what you can learn about the dynamics of a meeting and the people when you just kind of see what's going on in the room. So you might, first of all, just have a lot of conversation going on in the room, but nothing of substance is really being decided, or nothing of substance is really being said. Sometimes you might just have people in the room who are just talking to hear themselves talk. I see a couple heads nodding, but I know that we've encountered that in all of our lives. You might, on the other hand, have someone in the room who's just not speaking at all. And if this is a really important stakeholder, or if this is someone who you know represents a really important team or a really important app, maybe that could be a problem too if that person is kind of just staying mum. And so be aware of who's just kind of staying really quiet during a meeting. This emoji is meant to illustrate this physical body language, right? So if you see someone in a room like this, what do you think that means? Anyone? Detached? Disagreeing and unhappy. Yeah, it's negative body language, right? Because the physical body language reads they're closing themselves off. Like if you see someone like this, they're probably not going to be open to whatever you're suggesting, or maybe even open to the discussion if they're doing this. So this is a huge physical tell. Sometimes for us, it's habitual. It's also comfortable just to lean back and do this. But be aware, during a meeting, this can be a really big physical tell. Another physical tell is someone leaning in. Or not. During a meeting, if you're at a meeting with a conference room table or whatnot and people are seated, someone who is, pretend I'm sitting, someone who's at the table, and if they're doing this and they're nodding and they're leaning in, their body language, right, just like Sheryl Sandberg illustrated, they're engaged, they're interested in what you're saying, they're actively participating, and they're interested. If someone is not leaning in, then it probably is just, that can be read in certain ways, but that could also be another version of this. One time, as a quick anecdote, I remember I was in a meeting with several business analysts, and there was one business analyst who was asking questions about process, and then the resident senior business analyst walked in. And she immediately zoned in on who was talking, asked a couple questions, kind of very directly and very bluntly. And the BA that she was talking to started like this, his body language, he was engaged, and then by the end of it, he was leaning back in his chair like this. And when I saw the BA, I saw the instant and it switched where he was talking, he was defensive, he had a furrowed brow, all things that you can read from someone in a room. And as soon as he did this, and I was just like, oh geez, it's over. Because she had shut him down, and sometimes that can happen in a meeting. So, reading the room. Power poses. Power poses tell you who your decision makers are. This is a very unnatural pose to me, so I don't know what it says about me. But if you're leaning back in a chair and you cross your legs and you do this, what does that tell you about the person who's making that pose in the room and their influence on the group? When I was Googling for power poses, I got Oprah and Mick Jagger, and then I decided to stop. I was like, well, it can't get any better than that. Power poses can tell you a lot about who's in a room. And so lastly, read the people in the room. It's a tool. You may not have to acknowledge it. You may not have to say anything, be Yoda. But it can tell you a lot about the dynamics in the conversation and how it's going and what's actually happening during a meeting. So, all right. Now we're going to get to 2 slides I have on how to make sure you keep your meeting moving along. Slide number 1. Is the polite version. This is the way you can just kind of very politely nudge people along during the meeting. So things you can do, things you can say. Anyone on an Agile team probably has heard the version, can you guys take this offline? Which basically means, I think you guys are talking about something that's relevant to 1 or 2 people versus the entire group. That's a pet peeve of mine, and this doesn't apply only to Agile teams. If you're in a meeting and you think of a really, you have a burning question or a burning issue that you need to talk out right then and there, that's great, bring it up. But then at some point, if you notice, or if you as the facilitator notice that only one person is talking to about like 1 or 2 other people, or 3 people total, and this might be in a total meeting size of like 7 people, like we said, right? If they're not talking about this thing that's relevant to the entire group, ask them to take it offline, because at that point, you're wasting the group's time. You're there for an hour. It's always hard to get people together, and individual conversations like these can happen outside of your meeting. You can always ask, do we have to find the solution for this right now? Or if you like the gerund form, are we solutioning? These are all nice ways to kind of, to send the signal to people, are we off track? Is this something you 2, 3, you guys can talk about later, so like I just said. And then my teams know what this means, finger in the air, right? The conversation can still go, because I'll actually show you guys how this progresses. So the volleyball side out is just a little more dramatic, but all of these are physical gestures to get the visual attention of people talking. They may not necessarily even need to stop talking, but let's say there's a super heated debate going on, and you know that time has dragged on, and you decide finger in the air. This can just get everyone's attention, and people knows what this means. They're just like, okay, our facilitator has the finger in the air. We probably need to move on. Now, if they're stubborn and they keep going, then you can start drawing circles. This is something I've conditioned my teams to recognize. So you just start drawing circles. And some people interpret this as we're going in circles. I tend to think of it as let's move it along, right? And then the version of circles, if the team keeps going, then I give it a couple revolutions, and then I start drawing bigger circles. And then the team gets the message. So these are some physical cues you can use. Volleyball side out is really dramatic. I tend not to use that one too much. So time check, stating the obvious, right? You could always physically look at your watch. A lot of people ignore that. So you could always verbally say, oh, time check. We have 10 minutes left. What are we going to try and get out of this? Time check is really effective. I don't know why, but if you tell people they have 10 or 15 minutes left, they will switch gears and go with you. And as a facilitator, you want people to like you because you're trying to get them to give you information. So use humor and use self-deprecation. I worked with a Scrum Master once who was just always kept the team on task, kept them moving from update to update. His stand-ups were very crisp and just like a little regimental. But no one ever complained about him as the facilitator because he used a whole lot of self-deprecation. And he would always interrupt the group with, guys, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but can we move it along? and he was just so humble about it that they were like, oh yeah, sure, of course. And so they would go along. So don't be afraid to keep things moving along. You can always use any of these, and they should work pretty well. Version 2. If people are not responding to the previous slide, and they're not taking your hints, and they're not noticing how subtle you're being, then you can actually bring out the big guns. So, like I said in the meeting invite, this is what you can do. For instance, if you have someone who's sucking all the air out of the room, and they just won't yield the floor, use the physical space. Meeting the format and the layout of the room, like we talked about, that's a part of it. But if you're headed into a meeting, and I'll use an example from this past year. If you're headed into a meeting where you know that there's going to be someone who just loves the sound of their own voice, and they love to talk, and you regret giving them the floor, or maybe they head towards the whiteboard, and you're like, oh no. Use the physical space. I have been in meetings before where I knew this person was coming and I was like, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange the table into a block in front of the whiteboard. I'm going to restrict access to the whiteboard. Then I'm going to tell my team, I want you to strategically sit here, 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 and here. So the only open seat left is for this one person, and he's the farthest away from the board. And then I'll use the excuse, I'll have the person nearest me. I was like, you're the unofficial timekeeper. Make sure we stay on time. But use the physical space to your advantage when you know things like this. Prevent that person from getting near the whiteboard, or do whatever you can to try and keep them on task and constrained. Or you yourself could be the heavy. I was in a meeting one time where we were going through a lot of scoping and estimating, and we had a lot of decisions to make in a very short amount of time, which is the case usually with meetings. And we had a wide variety. We had a wide variety of participants. We had designers, we had engineers, we had architects, we had folks from the business, we had designers. And I had one designer who was kind of close to the front of the room, and he was chiming in with a lot of really great detail. But I could tell that his input was totally geared for like when you're 3 months into the project, and he was giving you like really detailed information you would need 3 months down the line, and not then and there in that meeting where you were scoping and trying to make some high-level strategic decisions. So he was right there and he was talking, and I, with humor and tact, walked over and just did this. And I encroached on his physical space, which can be very effective. Guys who are larger, play this card carefully. Do it with humor. But play that card carefully. Not all of you are petite like me, and you may not be able to carry that off. But you know, with humor, if you can stand and lean over someone, and be sure to smile. It had the intended effect on the designer, and he immediately kind of looked up at me, and he was just like, "Oh, should I be moving on?" I was like, "That'd be great," and we did. So use physical proximity, but carefully for some of you. Use a deadline. Kind of like that time check, but also in a meeting, if you know that you just have a lot of things to get to, you could always draw their attention back to the agenda. Say, hey guys, here's our agenda. We're right here and we need to get through here at the end of the meeting. Use that deadline as a way to kind of help the group mentally reset. Use your team. If you have someone who's just kind of going on and on, don't be afraid to use your team. By using secret signals. You have to have a very cooperative team that you work with frequently for some of these to work, right? But I've used secret signals. You can use the nod. You know, you have to decide on these beforehand, by the way, for them to be effective. You can use the blink. You can use whatever it is that you want. But if you're going to have people in the meeting from your team, and you know, don't be afraid to use them to help you get through the meeting and help you get them to make the decisions that they need to make. You can always create an artificial deadline. I'll drop Greg's name. Greg and I were in a meeting where things were just going on, and Greg didn't make this up, but I did. And things were just going on in this meeting. I couldn't really get the control of the meeting back, and so eventually I piped up, and I looked at my watch, and I looked at Greg, and I was like, Greg, don't you have a hard stop and need to get out of here at 5 exactly? And Greg, bless his heart, picked up immediately on it. He was like, yes, I do. And I was like, great, let's keep going. And immediately we shifted gears and went on with the conversation to where it needed to go. So as a facilitator, don't be afraid to create artificial deadlines and pull those out of the air. Props. These can also, these I also recommend you pre-arrange with your team and use them carefully. But if you have teams that are willing, you can do things like this, where these are actual screenshots that I used with a team on a project one time. And they're like soccer cards, football cards for the Europeans in the room. Where we had one guy on the team, his name was Ross. Ross was super smart. He could tell it like no one else. But Ross, on my team, had a habit to go on and on. And we said to him, we was like, Ross, you're kind of making us look bad because you're doing all the talking and we're not. Can you please, like, you know, give us a little bit of talking space, you know, offline in a conversation before the meeting. And so what I did was I took 2 sticky notes and my yellow flag, which was Ross, dial it down a notch. And then we had the red card, And we use these on our phones because it was a team that was really plugged into their phones, and we could kind of send each other feedback via group chat on our phones. And so at some point when Ross began to monopolize the conversation, I sent him a red card and I was like, Ross, pipe down. let some of the rest of us talk. So be creative, right? Like soccer cards or whatnot. You can be creative about how you can bring elements like this in to manage your meeting as a facilitator. But a lot of these can work really well, especially if you have a team that can kind of get your back, especially when you're trying to be the heavy. So and always use it with humor, because as a facilitator, you got to get people to like you. So use humor. So as a wrap up from the during your meeting section, other things to remember, it's not about you, right? No ego. Sometimes people get riled up during meetings. Sometimes if you ask them to make a decision, they may not respond well. You may not know what they have going on during that day or understand all the different factors behind the decisions they have to make. And ultimately, it's not your decision. It's not your solution. You're there to just get the information out of the group to lead them to an answer. Watch the clock as a facilitator, right? Your meeting, I would say most of our meetings tend to be 30 or 60 minutes, right? Develop an internal clock if you can, because you can't always be pulling a phone out of your pocket. You may not always have a clock on the wall. I've somehow over the years developed this magical sense of being able to know when 20 minutes has gone by. I don't know how or why, but 20 minutes means either that a third of my hour-long meeting has gone by, or it means 2/3 of my half-hour meeting has gone by, and somehow I just know. So watch the clock. And then on a positive note, I always tend to think that sometimes when you have meetings, when meetings end, sometimes they can be uncomfortable if they just kind of trail off. Like people really like finality, like the end of a really good Tchaikovsky symphony. You know when the ending is. End on a positive note, or just tell people thanks, for coming, so that they know the meeting has ended. And that's a nice way to close. Let's see. All right, I know it's a school night, so trying to move things along and make sure we get out of here at a good time. Tools that you can use during your meeting. Visuals. Please use visuals. Remember the shared pool of understanding? Always use visuals. As a facilitator, my preference is to always go into a room where you have one of these, where you have a whiteboard. Even if you have a lot of smart people seated around a table, and even if things are going great for you as a facilitator, there's no conflict, everyone's smiling, everyone's happy, and they're talking constructively, that's not going to be as effective as if you start drawing and visualizing something on the board. Because once you put it out there, you get everyone out of their heads and looking at what you have on the board, and suddenly they will think of other things, or they will, in an ideal scenario, nod and agree, oh yeah, this is what we're talking about. But if you're in a meeting and you're not using visuals, and you're just relying on all of this, this conversation happening around the group for people to just rely on that, what's happening is, first of all, you have to rely on the fact that people are just hearing each other. I've worked with people in different offices where some people would talk this loudly, and they would be in the same room with you, and they thought they were fine. But and I've been in stand-ups, in daily agile stand-up meetings, where like the person was no farther from me than from that chair, but they were talking like this, and I literally would lean in closer to them to try and just hear them, because some people just don't project. Right? So if you're not using visuals, number one, you're counting on people just even hearing you. Number two, you're counting on them doing that processing in their head, and they're comparing it to that triangle they have in their head. Maybe they just heard you talk about a square, but then they're doing the mental translation of comparing it to the triangle, and suddenly they're in their heads and they're thinking, and they may not be listening to you at all. And if you have anyone hostile in the meeting, or if you have a really technical or really complex meeting and you're trying to juggle all of that without visuals, don't do it. Just use visuals. Go to the whiteboard. All right, this next slide. Who knows what this is? Nobody over there. Tell me. What? What was that? Somebody said something. It's a parking lot. Okay. The parking lot is a great tool. So if you're using, if you're using visuals, one of the visuals I encourage you to use is not to actually go out to a physical parking lot with automobiles, But let's say you're writing things on your whiteboard. Every meeting I've been to, where you have critical decisions to make, there are going to be tangents. There are going to be sidebars. People are going to bring up things that should be discussed with another group, in another meeting, and another time and place. That's what the parking lot is great for. You could take part of your whiteboard and just label it parking lot. Or you could take sticky notes on the board. You could take anything. But it's just important that when you use a parking lot, when you hear someone mention something, you acknowledge it, you write it on the parking lot and say, oh, that's a great topic, but I don't think that's what we're here to talk about today. It's hugely important that you write it on the parking lot, large enough for everyone to see it, by the way. Don't write this small where people can't see what you're writing. But that way you acknowledge that you heard what they were saying. That makes the person feel heard, and then it's okay for you, the group, to turn back to whatever it was you were talking about and move on. So really great tool. I don't even think about it anymore. The power of narration. This is a really great one. It's kind of a variation on that theme I talked about earlier of stating the obvious. How many of you have ever been in, let's say it's a meeting where you were hosting this over like WebEx or Hangouts, and someone started doing a demo, right? So they started doing a screen share, or maybe they were trying to show the group something and they're like, oh, let me just pull up the app. Oh, let me pull up a browser, right? And then they started just doing whatever it was they needed to do. They started using the app. And then the air goes dead. So never, ever, ever, as the facilitator, underestimate the power of narration, especially if you are in the driver's seat and you are taking the people through a particular part of the app, usually to illustrate something. Tell them what you're doing, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to bring up Amazon, and type this into my URL, and now we're going to go take a look at the shopping cart because the issue, and you just, literally, you're just telling them what you're doing and telling them what you're seeing, and it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's actually really, really effective, because I'll tell you what happens is if you don't narrate and you start driving and you start walking people through the app, and the air goes dead, people pick up their phones, their attention starts wandering, and you've lost the group. Versus if you're there and you're narrating for them, you keep their attention. That's something that you want. So. All right, and the personalities in the room. This is a little bit more on kind of the previous slide that we saw. So first off, here are examples of people that you would love to have in your meeting. I'm sure if you guys read through this, you probably can think of or know examples of each of these types of roles, each of these people that you have seen in a meeting. These are great people. These are the people you love to have in your meeting as a facilitator. They're the ones who really make the meeting go along. Things really get cooking with them. Other personalities that can appear in the room are like these guys. And I think some of these are self-explanatory. If there are any that are not, feel free to shout out questions and let me know. But we've talked about some of these, like the quiet one, right? The person who may be an important stakeholder, maybe is having a bad day, but they're being quiet. The negator, the negator, the person who never has anything positive to say about anything, which can be challenging for you as a facilitator. The gorilla in the room, some of you know, but the gorilla in the room is a lot like that one person who everyone defers to, right? Maybe they're a talker, maybe they're not. Maybe it's by virtue of seniority or something else. Whatever the reason, you might have a gorilla in the room who kind of just squashes all healthy debate and collaboration. That's something to know and to watch out for. What else? Any others that I can talk about? The Steve Jobs, you are dismissed. I get a lot of questions about this one. Does anyone know that one? Does anyone know that anecdote? Okay. So this is pretty amazing in my opinion. So Steve Jobs, once upon a time, was in a meeting, and there was a woman from marketing who was in that meeting. And so Steve Jobs arrives to the meeting. He was a little bit late. He wasn't there at the beginning, but he's Steve Jobs. He can do that. Everyone else, start your meeting on time. He walks in. sits down and starts listening to the conversation. He takes a visual scan of the room, looks at this one woman from marketing, and interrupts the meeting and asks her, "Who are you and what is your name?" And she explained, I don't remember her name, but she explained, "Oh, I'm from marketing. You know, one of the key marketing projects I'm on is related to the project that's being discussed in the room." And so Steve said, he absorbed it, he thought about it, and then he said, "I see. Well, you don't need to be in this meeting. Thanks a lot." And he just dismissed her, and like in the next breath, went right back to the conversation at hand. So you personally never want to be that person. But I think the point of that I was trying to make, where the reason why I put that on the slide is be aware of who's in your meeting, right? You're the facilitator, and so you can control who's being invited. Don't invite the people that Steve Jobs would dismiss out of hand like that to your meeting, because they probably don't need to be there. All right. If you guys have any questions about any of these, feel free to ask me afterwards. Nice to haves. So we're still in tools, and these are things that me personally I think are exactly what they say. They're really nice to have. You don't have to do these, but I think they can really help you as a facilitator just smooth things out and make things really go fast. So the first one, learn how to type fast. It may sound really simple, but as a facilitator, if you're ever on the big screen, and a lot of the times as the facilitator, you're there to capture, you're there to record your own notes, right? You're there to record the decisions of the group. If you know how to type fast, you can keep up with the group and you can record as you go. If you can't type fast, you're probably not going to take notes, or you're probably going to slow yourself down. Try to type fast.
You mentioned no screens.
Oh, but well, that's in specific contexts. No screens for certain meetings, as part of the ground rules, right? Yeah, question in the back.
Well, what's your take on like public note taking? Like, there's some times where I'll pull up Confluence on the projector and take notes during the meeting.
Sure. That can be hugely effective, because part of and you know, there's no one. I'm never going to tell you guys, don't do this, do that. Well, that's not true. Don't ever suck the air out of a room. But all of these are tips and tricks, right? Techniques that you can use during a meeting. Deploy them, as with your best judgment. Taking notes on a big screen, hugely helpful. Sometimes to help people focus and really crystallize what they're hearing, as a visual reminder of, oh, here are the things we're talking about. Oh, here are the things that we've decided. I've been in meetings before where I did literally that. We had a big screen. There was a lot of involved debate going on around the table, but we also had stuff on the board. I pulled up just a notepad off to the side and started recording short bullets about what we were deciding in that meeting. And at one point, my architect looked over at something that I wrote, and he was like, "Wait a minute, no, that's not what we heard. That's not what I heard. That's not what we decided." And I was like, "Actually, so-and-so here, yes, I think that's what we heard." And so we went on a quick little 1-minute tangent, confirmed it, and that point might have been lost if they hadn't had that visual reminder, just kind of that visual list of, hey, here's what we decided. Typing fast can help you do that. Learn how to write fast, right? Sometimes if you're at a whiteboard, I was going to do an example of this, but I'm not going to do that today. But if you're ever facilitating and you're capturing things, or you're using visual aids and you're up at the whiteboard, have you ever seen that meeting where your facilitator is getting information from the group, right? So and then they turn and they turn to write whatever it is or draw whatever it is they're thinking of on the board, and suddenly they're drawing at 20 words per minute equivalent. And then the meeting becomes about watching this person write. And you all can think faster than 20 words per minute. You all can type faster, but we're talking about writing. But at any rate, this person is just laboriously and slowly writing. And it's just like what I was saying about the power of narration, right? The power of narration is what happens when the air goes dead. Well, that's kind of the visual equivalent of someone writing super slow at the board. And I've seen this in meetings because I'm just like, oh, yeah, we just lost all the flow. Okay. So learn how to write fast. It's a nice to have, but it can really help you keep things moving at a good pace during your meeting. You have to write legibly. Learn your keyboard shortcuts. This is especially true if you're going to be on the big screen, if you're going to be demoing and switching between a lot of your apps, if you're even going to be doing a lot of note-taking or whatever, and you need to highlight words or navigate quickly without using your mouse, learn your keyboard shortcuts. It's a great nice to have. Amp it up a little. If you guys can't tell, I tend to go high energy. I like to try and make meetings energetic and more high energy, because I tend to think that it's a nice thing, and it tends to make everyone kind of more alert and helps meetings go by more pleasantly. All right. So after your meeting, what do you do? If you don't, hopefully there are beers involved, but not every meeting. You can't have beers after every single meeting. So after your meeting, what are you doing? So go ahead and publish those decisions that you captured along the way, because I can guarantee people will need something to refer back to. Don't rely on the power of the spoken word, because people will forget about the power of the spoken word and they will need something to look at later. So go ahead and do that for clarity, and sometimes you may need to do that kind of as a CYA, but it's always better to just kind of recap for everyone, hey, here's what we discussed, here's what we decided, here's what we're going to do. Cover your ass. CYA. So, schedule follow-ups. As the facilitator, it's probably on you to make sure that you've gone through this arc of discussion in one meeting. You've probably reached some discussion and decision, but there are probably follow-ups that need to happen. Go ahead and do that. Make sure that you keep that momentum going forward. And then you rinse and repeat, right? You kind of take all of this, you take whatever you've learned in this first meeting of yours with this one group. You rinse and repeat. Use what you've learned about the room. Use what you've learned about each of the individual people in your meeting, and what may or may not be effective, so that next time it can go more smoothly. And then at the end of your meeting, I hope you guys found this helpful, and it's been fun for me to give this talk, and I hope you guys liked it too. So thanks for coming out, everyone. I know it's a Tuesday night, it's a school night, so I'm trying to get you guys here out of time. And like I said, I had a lot of fun, and so I hope you guys did too. So any questions? Comments, questions? Mauricio.
Yeah, so what if I don't have enough people to actually have a separate facilitator?
Mm-hmm.
What if I have to be in the meeting, like I am one of the stakeholders, I have to participate on it, but I also have to be a facilitator. How do I balance the position?
Right. Right. Some of us may not always have the luxury of having a separate facilitator. In that case, you may have to be the facilitator. Or in your case, it sounds like you may actually be leading a meeting, which is a different role, but you could still use a lot of what we've talked about here, just in terms of reading the room, the tools and tips that we've talked about. Did that answer your question? Yep. Okay. So someone. Oh, go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Sorry?
Do you need to make sure there's a decision maker in the group or not?
Oh, I can't say I've ever facilitated a meeting where I said, you're the guy who's going to make the decision.
No,
Okay.
When you invite people,
Uh-huh.
do you make sure there is somebody that can finalize
Oh,
the discussion and make a decision, or it's democratic?
yes.
How do you,
Um,
all the meeting by nature has a senior person there that can make the decision?
Right, right. Yeah, the question was, when you're setting up your meeting, do you as a facilitator pick and choose who your decision makers are going to be?
I don't think you can choose.
I don't think you can either. Yeah, that was
But
going to be my
you
answer.
make sure that there is some, because if you get a group of people, as I said,
Mm-hmm.
and there's discussion, everybody's arguing with everybody else,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not the subject matter,
Mm-hmm.
who's the person who's going to finally make the decision? So
Mhm.
I guess
It's somebody in the room.
hopefully at the end of the discussion to say, okay, we'll go this way
Right.
or that way.
Right, right. And so the question was, what happens if people are arguing and they're not coming to a decision? In that case, that's not on me. That's not on you as the facilitator to provide the solution. I've been in a lot of meetings where there were a lot of people in the room who are way smarter than me and know a lot more about technical domains. I'm never going to be able to argue my way out of a bag in that meeting. But what I can do as a facilitator is engineer the flow of the meeting and make sure that if people are just kind of going on, and as a facilitator, you can start to recognize, if conversations are starting to go like this, they're just talking, but they're not getting to any decision. That's where you as a facilitator can step in and say, it's like, okay, guys, what's going on? Like, where are we landing on this is something that I might say. But that's where it's on you to make sure that you, as the facilitator, enable a healthy level of discussion, but you also make sure that the group ultimately makes decisions, and that you guide them out of that.
Group make a decision.
Mhm.
You assume that it's democratic, like you say, okay, let's vote on it. Or
Nope, I do not.
It's a person that it's a senior person that says, okay,
Mhm.
we're going to do it this way versus that.
Mhm. Yep. I'm not making the assumptions that it's a democratic decision. Sometimes decisions boil down to just one or two, or maybe even one decision maker, and the meeting might be about just educating the rest of the group around the why and the context. In other meetings, you might have healthy debate, and you might need the group to actually come as a group to make a decision. It won't always be one way or the other. I saw Sarah, and then I'm coming to you in the green shirt. So Sarah had a question. Right. Retros are a whole other ball of wax and a whole other level of sharing. And in that case, it can be handy to have someone not of the group, not of the team, step in and be the retro facilitator. I've guest facilitated retros. It's really fun. So.
One thing that I would add, just in response to his question, is that I think the process of leading towards a decision is something that starts when you're setting the agenda.
Oh, yes.
A well-designed agenda isn't just a list of topics for discussion, although it may sometimes be written that way. A well-designed agenda starts with what's the decision that we want to have out of this.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, sometimes that may not be the decision that, the question that you end up answering. Sometimes it may start with, should we go with option A or option B? And at the end of the meeting, you say, okay, the action item is, we'll do this research on A and this research on B, which means that your question shifted from, okay, I see that we're not going to answer the question of A versus B. Can we instead shift the question to, what research do we need to do before we can answer the question?
Right.
Yeah, but when you have a lot of intelligent people in the room,
Yeah.
everybody is like pushing his own way, right? Because we see the universe in one way versus that way.
Yeah.
So I know that most of the meetings that I attended, with all of them, there was always a decision maker, which means there was the senior guy there that eventually, as a team, we could not.
I think it depends on the context.
It-
as Yvonne said.
it depends.
There are some teams that
Yeah.
are democratic, some teams that are
Right.
autocratic,
Right.
some that are consensus based, some where everyone's looking at the senior guy just so you can nod.
Right. But I think what you said, that was. Well, let me. I think a really great point you made, though, is that as the facilitator, let's say you go to a meeting and on the agenda you say, we're going to talk about option A and option B, and we're going to make the goal of this meeting is to make a decision. And then in the course of the meeting you discover, we don't have enough information. We need to go ahead and research. As the facilitator, if the group decides that, that's great. That's a great meeting by me, because the group decided that we don't have enough information, and our agreement was to go away, research, and come back. But as the facilitator, don't get hung up on the idea that that your meeting may need to have a specific format, or your meeting may need to be decided a certain way, or even that you may need to arrive at a very specific decision. You just go wherever the group goes. Your meeting's going to flow wherever it needs to go. Your job, again, no ego. It's not about you as a facilitator. You're just there to guide them to the decision, but you have no stake in the decision itself. We're talking about,
I agree with this because you said at the beginning, the facilitator is not a subject matter expert.
right,
So clearly the people in the room are the people that's supposed to make the decision, right? The question is, he may be in a position where you don't get, I mean, there's a meeting where he knows that the decision is not going to be reached because of whatever argument.
mm-hmm.
So for example, like for the next, and as I said, know the people in the group, right? So if he sees that you go to a group and in the previous meeting you were in a group and
Mhm.
nothing came out of it because, they could not reach a conclusion, the question is, would you set the meeting in such a way that you're going to have a senior paper or something that a decision can be reached? Because at the end of the day, a meeting will be, it's not just to disseminate information, right? Because you can disseminate an email or whatever. It's also to get to a decision on some, whatever subject at hand, right?
It is. I have a question in the back. I think she wants to respond.
Just say, part of the preparation is not just the nuts and bolts of the issue at hand, whether it's, A versus B, but when you prepare, I think you also quietly are assessing the people and going, okay, which of the characters in that little list, are these types of people? What are the politics, okay? So I may know you are an A person, he's an A person, these are Bs. These are people who kind of lean towards Bs or they have a B mentality. These are the people who are asleep, or undecided, and so on. So you assess personalities, you assess politics, and you assess the issue at hand, and you assess who informally are the decision makers. There may be a formal one, but there may be everybody always looks at this gentleman, because everybody knows he's the guy who we all really look up to or has the most weight, So you look at things
Every meeting is different, right?
like this.
Despite, I'm sure, all the meetings we've been to, none of them have ever been exactly the same. So I can't give you a solution that would cover all meetings. But I think the sense I'm getting from all of you guys is that you do get it. You just, as a facilitator, one of the best things you can learn how to do is sit back, watch the room. Sit back and observe what's going on, so that you can take that knowledge to your next meeting if you have more meetings with these people again. So I saw you had a question.
I had one example. We had an architect that was, his work was long, and he was laying down this design, and I looked at it, and I knew there was immediately a big flaw, and I called him out on it immediately, because we were going to waste a lot of time and effort. At first, he was fighting me, and I said, "Stop and think about it." He finally did stop and think about it and said, "I got to rethink this." Sometimes you do have to go against the official authority because it's like you're going to waste the company's time and effort. I mean, I've done it. I mean, he didn't like me for it, but on the other hand, he got the right design as a result.
Right, and sometimes as the facilitator, voices like that will be a godsend in your meeting. Sometimes they're the ones who are saying it like it is. They're stating the obvious. Other times, if they're not as tactful as what you described, they could be the ones who are fomenting dissent, and they're going to take your meeting off track. So every scenario is different. Every meeting is going to be different. But as you think about the tips and tricks that we talked about today, and most importantly, as you develop your skills of observation as a facilitator, you become more and more skilled, and you can basically start driving meetings the way that you want them to go. So, all right, one more question, and then I want to make sure you guys get out of here at a decent hour. So, Richard.
Where you work, were people allowed to pick their facilitator? Where I worked in the group, it was like everybody had to take a turn, and the next person who wasn't directly involved in that software would be the facilitator. And then like the author of the main author, someone would work with the facilitator, decide who to be at the meeting. You said something that makes it sound like people would want you as a facilitator, and we never had a choice.
Most places I've worked, you never have the luxury of a separate person being in the role as a facilitator. I have in the past worked with some consulting companies where we would go out and host workshops. And in that sense, some of us on the team would be specifically there to facilitate a group kind of this large, to get information from a wide variety of people in the audience, and to get a wide group of people to agree on a new business process or a new decision. And so in that sense, there was a very specific defined role. Most of us, I think, in real life, in the day-to-day, aren't going to have that luxury. So it's nice when you can find a facilitator, but most of the time, this is probably something you're going to have to do and juggle as probably the leader of a meeting. So.
Yeah, we didn't call it facilitator. That's what it would be. You have the author of the code,
Mm-hmm.
like the leader of the walkthrough and technical review, and it was it was like the next person on the list would be that, and you would say, you're the author, you would see who's next.
Right. Right. Yeah. So. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming out. I hope you all enjoyed the talk and found something useful. So.